Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Kerfuffle showcase, and I am delighted to have Joe and Pete here today from Kamma Data. Hello, gents. How are you? You both well?
Really well, gentlemen. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, great to be here.
Now, first things you almost said that like you meant it, Joe. So well done.
Right?
I get a little synopsis sent over to me by Sarah, which feels like a bit like a Supplier Tinder. It gives me a bit of info. I know, don't hang up just straight away, guys. But I'll point out it seems like you and I, Joe, have had very different ideas of what to do in the lockdown. So your extracurricular accolades are a triumph of enthusiasm over ability. He has an amateur boxing record of 110 and completed both the Sally-Up Challenge and a no prep trail marathon during lockdown. I've managed to sign up for both Uber Eats, Deliveroo, and Just Eat. That's my challenge. And then Peter, to go all topper on Joe. You like extreme sports like cave diving, ultramarathon, skydiving, and you may even find him occasionally mudlarking around the Thames. Well, needless to say, that last one, yeah, I can avoid that. I don't think I really understand, but I know that's what I'm going to do the minute the London pubs are open and I'm back down there. But honestly, guys, you're making me look really bad here with all these extreme sports.
Well, it's what you do, Simon. When the pubs close, you find other ways to entertain yourself, right?
It's looking that way. It's looking that way. So, guys, look, we obviously had you on. We were talking obviously about the top 40. Fantastic. Obviously, you guys were obviously included in the EA Masters top 40 there in terms of innovation ideas. Today's our full one though, where we want to find out much more about what you do here. And one of the things that you come back to us talking about is authorities stand to gain £2.3 billion from a licensing crackdown in 2021. Does this put agents in the crosshairs? Now, I think you've got the attention. You certainly got my attention here. Who wants to just to kick us off?
I'll step forward, Simon. So if you take it live, I can take us through the start of the presentation. I'm kind of Pete warm-up act, if you like. So I'm going to kind of get everything going and leave him to kind of to see us out towards the end.
Good stuff.
Okay. So to give a brief background into Kamma. So Kamma are a race tech business. They've been around for a number of years. And what we really specialize in doing is connecting the dots from disparate information sources. So we use a whole host of different methods to collect information from different places. We take it when it's like dirty, unstructured, hard to read formats. We pull it all into one engine and deliver simple answers on a simple front end. So the first place we targeted was property licensing, specifically because it's so confusing, such a kind of a challenging area to get your head around, and so changeable as well. So it changed a lot frequently throughout the course of a week, for example. There's one change every 8 days. It also changes based on where you're on the country. So different local authorities have different rules of what you should do at different times for different kinds of properties. So we've pointed our engine precisely at this area to solve that complexity for agents and actually for a kind of quite a wide range of different organizations and companies within the field. So for this, sorry guys, are there other questions or should you just crack through?
No, I was just agreeing. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. So what we've got today is rather than just blather on about who we are, what we do, and why you should work with us, we're going to use some of our data, because we're a data-driven business. So we're going to use some of these stats to tell a story and talk to you about the latest landscape in 2021, hopefully give you some hints and tips on how you should be acting in order to minimize risk and maximize revenue opportunities. Before we talk a little bit more about the platform, why it's useful, again, just to lift the hood and give you a bit more kind of a background on how the tech works, before we kind of move into that final section where people are taking you through the products and giving you a bit of an insight into a Kamma deal for you for the full membership.
Oh, you team. I like all that. That's great. And just before we kick off, Joe, do you think that genuinely, as we're getting into winter, I'll make it, or Christmassy, do you think that agents genuinely do have a kind of snow blindness about compliance and this area? Is that a real issue? Just getting across to them the size of the potential risk?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That's why we're starting here as well. We think that licensing is not well understood. It's kind of a low awareness problem, and it's also exacerbated by inconsistent enforcement. There are 408 local authorities, which means there's going to be some that are good and some that are bad. So in some places, we actually do quite well, almost off the back of like an accidental ambulance chasing strategy. People get fined and they come to us and say, please help us to stop this happening in the future. In other places, people don't really realize they're under exposure with massive fines and massive risk. So there is a really big challenge around awareness and education, and that's where we're starting from today. So the first thing to bear in mind, the first stat we've got here is that almost a quarter, or just over a fifth, of rental properties do require some form of license. This is from the Kamma Mini data set. It's also validated by the Ministry for Housing Communities from the government. And if you break that down, if you look at the kind of licensing that needs, it's not just HMOs. So there is this. I mean, most people think licensing is linked to multiple occupancy households, which in England at least are defined as 5 people from 3 households sharing at least a kitchen or a bathroom. If you're in that type of household, if you're part of like a large student let, you fall within this easy to understand category of mandatory licensing, which is around half of all those properties that need a license. For some local authorities feel they have issues with antisocial behavioural orders beyond just that large HMO size. They put in additional licensing, that's for smaller HMOs. So it can be 3 people from 2 or more households, which puts far more properties into that definition. And then lastly, some local authorities feel they have an issue with all varieties of housing, and they use selective licensing. So selective licensing isn't just applying to HMOs, it can apply to any property. It's linked really to the number of people living there, not the number of households. And only 20% of any given local authority's housing stock can be under license without central government approval. So there's bureaucracy working in your favour a little bit there. But it does mean, therefore, that scheme boundaries get drawn in quite strange ways because they're trying to work out what's the best way of spending that 20% allocation. So it does make it more confusing.
Okay.
Now, the big challenge is, over the course of this year, not only we're seeing licensing, at a kind of a fairly widespread level, over a fifth, we're also seeing local authorities under real pressure.
So that's before that. Sorry, to just so I understand that. So literally before that's the second lockdown we're in at the moment, there was a deficit of 3.2 billion. It wasn't as if they were in a good state before the first lockdown, was it?
Absolutely, absolutely. These are reported numbers from the BBC, and this is news that we took. And we don't have financial stats following second lockdown, which is only just about to finish. Yeah. But even before that happened, councils were under facing a real challenge in terms of deficits. This is for 2 reasons. One is they're having to spend more money on frontline services, and the second is they're losing a lot on the income side. So council tax business rates are kind of, from if businesses shut down, they don't get them anymore. In many cases, people can't afford to pay. So they have more things to spend money on and less money itself. So they're asking the government for 4 billion at the moment to try and cover some of those gaps. And if they don't, they're going to cut services. So they're in a challenging situation. They're also, again, going back to this point of them having more money, more things to spend money on. There's like major social concerns. So we're all being locked into housing. There's a real social interest story, or stories in the press in the moment about the standard of homes that people are being locked into. So there's some data around overcrowding correlating very strongly with deaths from coronavirus, which is very sad to see. There's a lot of people talking about how sad it is that young kids are trapped in small flats, for example. So councils are under pressure to focus on housing. They're under pressure budgetary, and they need to respond in some way. And they've basically responded, it looks like, to us, like they're responding with yet more legislation. Yeah. So within our data set, we see a certain number of licenses per year, a certain number of consultations over the course of last year. I think it was something in the region of 1 new license scheme every 23 days. And we see consultations, at a similar sort of rate, maybe a few more, because not all of them turn into schemes. What we're seeing today, right now, on our database, there are 44 consultations ongoing at the moment. So we are seeing 2 years worth of licensing schemes being consulted on right now in our database, which will hit at the start of next year if they become actual schemes.
So if I look at that graph there, you can see that obviously when it first was kicking off in 2014, fairly steady uptake, but then it was plateaued pretty much for the 4 years, didn't it, from 2016, 17, and actually again, just a big uplift there, and more to come from what you're saying.
Yes. So what we saw earlier on that kind of the residential slide, looking at the number of homes, we said just over a fifth of homes need a license. If there's 400 local authorities, this is just over a quarter of local authorities had some form of discretionary scheme. That's the monetary and selective schemes known as discretionary as a group. And so around about 2018, 2019, 2020, we saw some flattening of the curve as A, those authorities who wanted to run a scheme already had one, and then B, coronavirus hit and they had too many other distractions. That's now come full circle, and all those schemes that didn't get pushed out in the last 2 years might get pushed out next year. Now, this is a projection. It's not perfect data. It's not definitely going to happen, but it's likely to happen. So it's something. It's a risk we need to manage and look after.
And I think a really good point to add there, Joe, is that we've seen over the last quarter there's been like a massive increase in fines. I think they've increased by around 25%, like nationally. And I think this is a direct correlation to where we see the market going in 2021. And I think that all the market indicators are all pushing in the same direction. That it's going to be much more aggressively led by councils to raise standards.
Absolutely.
Right. So on that then as well, there's a lot of time where legislation isn't backed up by enforcement, and it's a bit of a a toothless tiger, as they say. But actually, that's not the case here. This isn't legislation that you can just they're not going to get me here. I think many agents feel like GDPR, was again, what was it, the Millennium Bug 2.0, wasn't it? This is stuff that is genuinely, it's impacting, it's affecting agents that aren't on top of their game at the moment.
Absolutely. And that's probably the biggest concern that we have within the PRS is that licensing without enforcement only penalizes good agents and good landlords. So if you are misbehaving, if you are, undercutting the rules and the regulations, you aren't likely to hold your hand up and go and get a license because you know that your property needs certain alterations. So you don't go and do it. And actually, in fact, you fully deserve to be caught up for doing that, for not, delivering minimum standards for your tenants. Those good agents, which make up the vast majority of us, we've already got these properties of the right standard, of the right quality. You go and then pay for a license, which we didn't actually need to have in the first place because our house is already up to scratch. So enforcement is a huge part of the process. If it's not done right, it does penalise the good people rather than the bad. But because we're seeing so much action right now, we can't imagine that this increase in schemes won't come with an increase in enforcement, because we think it's driven by the need to achieve the end outcomes. It's not just them delivering lip service to it. We think, this is going into more detail, we think this is all based off the success that Newham had in raising not just licensing revenues, but also tax revenues. So one big misconception with licensing is that it's used as a revenue driver for councils. In actual fact, you cannot spend licensing revenue on anything other than putting it back into the system to kind of support enforcement again. They're not allowed to take licensing revenues and spend them on education or child services or anything else. They can only spend it on enforcement. So it's almost like a reinvestment in maintaining standards. This was issued,
isn't it, Joe? Most people do think that's the case.
Yeah, they do think it's just done to kind of to squeeze more money out wherever they can. So in actual fact, they can't use the licensing revenues for that. But in Newham, they thought they'd make 4 million from licensing. They actually made 23 million because so many landlords are actually existing under the radar. So they covered a huge amount. This is back in 2017. But here's the kicker: for every single pound in licensing revenue they're able to generate, they generated £5 in tax. Now that is not just going to the council. That is some council tax, but it's also capital gains tax and income tax as well. So they made a lot of money for HMRC. Yeah. So this is where they can spend on whatever they want. This goes straight into kind of the coffers for the authorities, both central and local. So we had a scheme, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, Westminster were in the press because they're consulting on a new discretionary scheme. They specifically referenced the success that Newham had in driving revenues or in driving standards to discretionary licensing. That was their kind of North Star as to why they're doing these things, why they're pushing out a scheme. We think many councils understand this. And there is a link between licensing and tax revenues, because you can catch out the rogue landlords. You can also catch out people who are kind of not paying their taxes.
In their head, it's win-win, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. You get two birds with one stone. You raise standards and you raise money. Why wouldn't you want to? And again, going back to that point, this is something which, if done right, does actually benefit. It's only when it's not enforced that it causes problems for the wrong people. So this is the size of the. This is the headline for the webinar. This is what I'm talking about. If you kind of carry through that same situation with Newham, where you're able to generate £5 in tax revenue from £1 license revenue, they made the 115 million, but nationwide we're talking about 1.9 billion. This is at a time when they're asking the authorities for 4 billion, as I mentioned earlier. They can cover half that amount themselves. if they just effectively enforce. So why wouldn't they? It feels like an absolute no-brainer. We have seen local authorities not always follow through before. This time, I'm pretty sure they're going to.
Good. Well, guys, thank you very much for that, taking the time to explain to us again. Just to remind everybody, of course, we'll be sharing out in the normal places, and this will be up on Kamma's landing page there. So if you need to find out more as well, of course, just please share this with your colleagues, and certainly they'll understand a bit more about it. Joe, thanks very much for that. It's a really, actually, that really is has helped me understand much more the size of the challenge, but also the opportunity there.
That's great, Simon. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Joe, thank you, Peter. Have a great day.
Take care.